I'm going to be talking to economist Dave Sawyer in this interview about industrial emitter carbon tax. And this is bringing down the emissions intensity of Canadian products if we're going to be exporting to Asia and to Europe, as Prime Minister Mark Carney wants to do. Oil is going to be apparently one of those products, and emissions intensity counts. We have a carbon tax, industrial emitter carbon tax, but it needs some tinkering, some reform, if you will. And I'm going to talk to Dave about that. He and his co-authors have just released a new report. Welcome to the interview, Dave.
Markham, thanks for having me.
Okay, so the report is combining industrial carbon pricing with an emissions cap could offer less than the sum of their parts. Came out yesterday. You have some co-authors, and it was published by the Canadian Climate Institute.
Yeah.
Before we get into the nuts and bolts of Canadian industrial emitter carbon tax policy or regulations, let's talk about why it's important at the global level, and particularly for oil, because both China and Europe, the EU, are putting in kind of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So if you have high emissions intensity, you get taxed more, correct?
Yeah, that's the way countries are going, right? They don't want their firms to be disadvantaged when they apply a price on their emissions to decarbonize and drive down emission intensity and emissions from their large emitters. They're worried about competitiveness. They don't want production to move offshore, so they're starting to put up barriers like the EU, the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is essentially a tariff that closes the gap between your carbon price and the home country's carbon price.
Yes, and in Europe, they brought in this in 2021, and they've been playing around with it. Now there's talk of applying it to petrochemicals and refining industries in between like 2027 and 2030, I think. And the
Right.
same is true in China. They have an industrial emitters carbon tax that got applied to the
Yeah.
power sector first. They tinkered with it and figured out how to make it work. Now they're applying it to petrochemicals and refining before
Yeah.
2030. So the two big markets we want to get into, emissions intensity counts.
And Japan. So yeah, that's right. So increasingly, not today, although some steel manufacturers, not the big foundries, but the steel sort of, the steel upgrade, they're not upgraders, but they're transforming products, shipping to Europe. They're all under CBAM right now, and they're going to have to be complying in the next little while. So yeah, it's going that way, and so emission intensity matters, and being able to basically tell the world what your emission intensity is, what your carbon price is, what you're up to, is part of that calculus.
Yes, I've interviewed Kevin Byrne from S&P Global many times about that, an economist who deals. He says the world is moving to a point where you have to be able to measure your intensity, and
Yeah,
and customers have to have confidence in the system that you use. That's a big deal. It's happened. It
yeah.
doesn't get a lot of public recognition, but that's coming, and there's no way to avoid it. So let's talk about the options here.
Okay.
We have the federal government's proposed oil and
Uh,
gas emissions cap. We have
yeah,
the existing industrial emitters carbon tax. And one of the options is to combine them. They'll have one on top of the other, I guess. And
yeah.
Alberta and the industry don't like that. Why is that maybe not the best option?
So, I mean, what's going on here? So, oil and gas emissions, primarily oil sands, because the methane regulations don't really apply to the oil sands. Their emissions keep growing, record production last year. They're now, oil and gas in total is about a third of national emissions, steadily rising emissions. Everybody else is decarbonizing. When you look at our national inventory, the historical data, including last year, because we're just starting to tumble those numbers, everybody else is more or less down except oil and gas. So the federal government stepped in because they can apply their carbon pricing backstop very well into Alberta without sort of going nuclear. And so they proposed this emissions cap, which would sit on top of the Alberta system as an adder, if you will. And it sort of made sense, but it really was double regulating. And that double regulating produced double sets of credits, which then undermine the larger carbon pricing systems, putting down, so too much supply, you're double crediting. These systems are already oversupplied, so it's a pure market. Downward pressure on the price. You add the cap more downward pressure on the price, and the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, I've interviewed you about this before, and your point is that in the Alberta system, the tier, as it's
Yeah,
called, the headline emissions price is $95 a ton. But
yeah,
because of all these surplus credits and other issues, the actual price is actually probably around $27, which really is
yeah.
not an effective incentive for any of these companies to lower their emissions.
Yeah, that's right. So maybe a $30 price isn't that bad, but it's really the expectations. So industry wants to bet. They don't want to roll the dice too, they don't want it stacked against them, but they're going to bet with their money, and not having certainty in the system, political certainty around Alberta fighting with the feds, uncertainty around how the cap's going to interact, political uncertainty with the federal government, and the Conservative Party wanting to kill the systems. Everybody's sitting on their hands.
Okay, so one of the options, instead of putting a cap and trade system on top of the existing carbon
Yeah,
tax, is to toughen up tier. And
yeah,
this we should make the point for viewers who aren't familiar with this. There is an equivalency agreement between Alberta and the federal government already. It was 2022 or 2023. They negotiated the next 5-year agreement where they increased the stringency of it. But I remember talking to an economist at the time, and they said they doubled it, but it really, in order to be effective, it had to go up 5 times. So it seems like the tier and the effectiveness and stringency hasn't kept up with what's actually required to lower emissions.
yeah. There's just too many. The market's long. There's just too, and first of all, it's not a really liquid, well-functioning market, right? It's sort of handshake deals. There's no exchange. There's some secondary exchanges starting to emerge. So there's not a lot of price discovery. People really don't know what's going on. So the opacity is a friction to making deals and understanding whether or not the system works. So you basically have a market that you don't understand, but you do know that there's too many units sitting around right now. Like there's 3 years of compliance sitting in Alberta. There's a bank. And so there's excess credits for 3 years. What does that mean? Generally, no one has to do anything for the next 3 years and spend a dime. Roughly, there's a distributional issue. Some have a lot of credit, some don't. But generally, don't have to do anything for 3 years. And the Alberta government's own fiscal plan just indicated this, where they go from revenue about 500 million a year down from 800 a few years ago because they weakened the system, down to 290 million for the next 4 years because there's going to be no payments because there's all these credits sitting around. So you're washing credits, and that's the first thing that's got to be cleaned up.
Okay, if that's the first thing, what are the other things that need to be cleaned up in tier to make it work?
Yeah. So what happened? I mean, the oil and gas cap. Go back to your original question. The oil and gas caps it's interacting negatively with the markets, driving the price down, which means the facilities outside of the oil and gas sector, cement, chemicals, all the other huge emitters, large emitters, they see weaker signals. So that erodes the whole effectiveness of the whole program. So that's really what the challenge is. So what we need to do, and so if you get rid of the cap and maybe use it for leverage, the feds use it for leverage to get Alberta to move and come to the table to start cleaning up their system. And it's fairly straightforward. We need more transparency. What's the market price? Let's get an exchange so we have terminals and we know what the price is, and we know where it's going. Let's have ways to deal with market instability. So stability reserves. So basically soaking up and releasing credits like they do in Quebec, like they do in Europe when the price gets out of hand. And there's sort of a price corridor where they manage to. It's sort of like an inflation target, same sort of thing. So there's a bunch of nuts and bolts stuff that needs to happen. Basically turn these things into functioning markets with some clarity for investors.
Let's review this a little bit because I can see where I've been covering this since 2016.
Right,
And it's still not the simplest story to report. And so
right,
let's try to do that just to simplify it. So along the industry, when I was talking to them 10 years ago, were saying we have to be cost and carbon competitive, right?
right.
They knew that emissions had to be priced in international markets for them to be competitive. So they supported the industrial emitters carbon tax at that time.
Yeah.
Then along comes this thing finally gets up and running, and there's an equivalency agreement between Alberta and the federal government. And then we kind of hit COVID, and that just throws everything into a mixer, and everybody needs to cost down because markets collapse. We come
Yeah.
out of that, and everybody's making money. And emissions and climate policy kind of start to become less of an issue. And the government in Alberta, the United Conservative Party, isn't real keen about fixing these problems to make the market
Yeah.
effective, to make the tier effective. And
Yeah.
so it just becomes less and less effective over time. And now
Yeah.
with the industry thinks that there's going to be nothing but rising demand out to 2050. It wants to go guns a-blazing in increase production and so on, and it just wants the tax gone. And you would argue, and your co-authors would argue, from a climate point of view and a competitive point of view, that is not smart, and the better way is to fix tier. Have I summed it up okay?
Yeah, fixed tier. And there's a little color commentary in there, right? So you know, the carbon pricing program, the tier and the large emitter programs impose a cost that's a fraction of the headline price. And it's designed that way to address competitiveness. So the oil and gas sector, and I've said this on your show before, they're paying a Timbit a barrel, 40 cents a barrel before they can write off tax and royalty interactions, about 30%, 25 to 30%. So you're down to 30 cents a barrel kind of range. So we're not, from a competitiveness perspective, and given Trump, especially for the oil and gas sector right now, we're not talking about, carnage, economic carnage here by strengthening these systems. If you're a steel facility in Ontario or aluminum in BC, we're like, okay, we can adjust. Let's look at this. Let's take a differentiated approach to the sector's circumstances. And that's what regulators typically do. And so the burden isn't uniform, but the burden is also not really heavy for everybody because it's designed to address competitiveness. So you got to be a little thoughtful about it. And industry, of course, hates paying pennies for anything. So they're very vocal. This is bad. This is bad. And it's more plausible right now given the Trump situation.
Exactly right. So this is I guess, let me put it this way. Trump has changed the politics of energy, at least in North America. And we
Yeah.
look at it differently now, and we think we need to get out to these other markets. But the other markets are, Asia and Europe, are very different than the United States, which doesn't price carbon and is never going to price carbon. And it seems to me that we can't think about the future and about these other markets in the same way that we think about the American market. We need to
Yeah.
have an adjustment in thinking. And
Yeah.
emissions plays a bigger role in competitiveness in Asia and Europe than it does in the United States. And it doesn't seem like we've made that mental gear shift yet.
We've known, I mean, we could have had this conversation 20 years ago with less nuance. In fact, we did probably 20 years ago. So the sector's known for a long time they need to do stuff. The misalignment with the US is a challenge, but California has a carbon price, Oregon has a carbon price, Reggie states, New England has a carbon price on their electricity. So it's not like there's nothing going on in the US. And secondly, this notion of decarbonized oil. I don't love that term, but I think of controlled versus uncontrolled oil. So there's going to be room as demand falls, and this isn't just me saying, oh, I want demand to fall. It's like the numbers indicate China is, demand is falling and for the product. So the controlled oil will there'll be space for it. The controlled LNG, there'll be space for it. Countries like Japan have commitments, global carbon reduction targets that they're actually working towards, and as is Europe. And the long-term signal is this stuff is going to continue to matter. And then when you look at what it costs for us for our energy sector and the margins being made and what the cost to clean it up a little bit are, you can continue, taps can continue to flow, investment can continue to flow, and you can do something about controlling emissions from oil.
So I can hear my audience asking they have a very puzzled tone in their voice, and they're going, "Why?" The
Why?
logic of reducing emissions seems to be inescapable here. And I'd like to offer a hypothesis for you.
Right. Okay.
Back in the day, when they were supportive of the of lowering emissions, I'm talking about the Alberta oil sands, they saw it as a competitive issue. I think it has disappeared from their thinking as a competitive issue, and they're dominated by the need to increase returns to investors. That's become a
Right.
very big issue. The investors want basically 100% or close to it of their free cash flow. So if they're paying 40, 50 cents a barrel in carbon tax, there's free money from their point of view that they could give back to their investors to keep them happy and keep capital flowing into the industry. Is that a reasonable hypothesis?
Sure. I mean, that's industry's job. Reward shareholders. That's the way the system's set up. But there's also rules of the game and safeguards. And those rules of the game and safeguards should be reasonable and there for a reason. And we collectively, globally, we need to reduce emissions. Look at the wildfires. I mean, you're shuttering in production now with the wildfires going, the incidence of these things going through the roof. You could argue all you want about what the causes are, but since 2010, the number of fires, floods, and disasters has gone through the roof. And you look at it every day. So it's insurance. It's low cost insurance. It's tech development. They have the know-how. It's insurance. And, you know, I yeah,
Look, I mean, thank you very much for this, Dave. We'll keep watching this story and we'll see. We now have a new prime minister. We actually have a new government, and Prime Minister
yeah.
Mark Carney's an economist. So if we ever had a prime minister who would understand the arguments that you've been making today, it would be Mark Carney. So we'll see how the government reacts to this as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Markham. Bye.